What the heck is going on, people? Today I figured I would do a kind of mock battle here against no one, because I did have a video where I went through and I read all the rules and it was really boring, and I figured there was literally no point since you can read the rules yourself. And in the video I mentioned, I was like, this game would be a lot easier if you just watched a game, so this is kind of gonna be that. So yeah, underneath this is the deck spot, so I just filled that with the card back. So now that we have our deck out of the way, we have 50 cards, there's no duplicate characters or boosts, and we made sure not to go over 3 of the same item. So how do we start here? Well, we're going to start by drawing 7. There, this is our hand. We don't have a lot of space to show it, but here you go. Here's our hand. Look at this. Wow, look at this hand. Wonderful hand, actually. It's almost like it was rigged. Cool, so we have our hand here. Don't mind the voice crack. Now we have a 1 cost character, so we're all set to go. So you can tell it's a 1 action cost character by the action cost box, which is red on the left side of a character card. And we also have one over here as well. So we actually have 2. He's a 7 cost. He does not count. If he was our only character, we would not have a starting hand. And oh, what's this? Our opponent actually didn't get a starting hand because they didn't draw a 1 cost character. Now what does that mean? That means we get to draw a card. Yay! Oh, that's not the right thing. Yay! We get to draw another card. Now if we were to not have our starting hand, we would be doing what our opponent is doing and shuffling all those cards back in the deck and drawing a new 7. Oh, look at that. He got his starting hand. Alright, so we get to choose one of our 1 cost characters to put into our front lines. And I'm gonna choose you. He would be face down for right now. There, we put him face down in the front lines, and our opponent did the same, even though it doesn't look like our opponent is alive. Now that we both have our 1 cost, we're gonna decide who goes first by rolling a dice that I don't have a PNG for. I'm calling evens, and it's evens. Okay, now I get to choose who goes first. And judging by my hand, I have a pretty dang good hand, so I want to be going first. Now, if you're going first, you are attacking first. If you are going second, you are drawing first. That is the main difference between going first and second. Now, we flip both of our cards over. Yo, what? That's crazy. Our opponent has the exact same card as us. But now it's our turn and we're going first, so we do not draw a card. We have to use whatever we have in our hand, so long as we can afford it. Now we have 1 action to use because it is our first turn. The action of every character in play is taken into account, which in this case is 1 as shown by the pink box here. So we have 1 action, which means we can only play things with a 1 action cost. All the action costs are on the left side of the card. On characters, it's red. On item cards, as you can see, there is nothing. That's because they don't give actions, so it's the only number in a box. We have 1 action here, and if I were to play this, I would play unlimiting options first for each of your open backline spaces. I get 1 extra action point to use this turn. Since we have 4 here, that means it would give us 4 actions to use. I'm going to use that. So now that the effect is used, I put it in the discard, and now we have 4 actions to use. And since we have 4 actions, I'm going to play Zip on the back lines here. There we go, put them into play. So now we have 3 actions left because that cost 1. And we're going to use a 3-for-1. We're going to draw 3 cards. Now, since we have 4 minus 2, we have 2 actions left. You know what? I'm going to play Hedgehog onto the back lines. And then I'm going to pass my turn, even though you should probably play a draw 3 or something. You typically don't want to have actions left over, but for the case of this example where I'm rigging everything, we're just going to allow it here. We have 1 left over, but since it is our first turn, we are not allowed to attack. This goes for our opponent as well. On your first turn, you may not attack. That includes both damaging attacks and non-damaging attacks. So now it's our opponent's turn. What is our opponent gonna do? I don't know. That's crazy. He also has a zip that he's playing, but unfortunately for him, that's the end of his turn now because he only had one action to use. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, your opponent on their first turn, since they went second, they picked up a card. And now it's our turn, and since it is no longer our first turn, we can pick up a card as well for free. Hooray! And now since it is not our first turn anymore, we can take into account attacking, and since Cornelius here does 7 and he only has 7 health, we can take him out. This is going to be really confusing, so if you don't understand it, don't worry about it, but I've technically picked up a card before calculating my actions, but it doesn't really matter except for very niche scenarios, which is most of this game is very niche scenarios, which is why watching it or playing it is probably going to be more beneficial than me explaining it. But yeah, so for this, I technically did it wrong, but technically it doesn't matter yet. So technically, don't worry about it. So now we're going to take our actions for the turn. So we first take it from our Frontlines character, which gives us 1, and then we take it from Zip, which gives us 3, and Hedgehog, which gives us 1 for a total of 5. When taking actions from your characters, you're only allowed to get 5. So say I were to have Chikikin here, and we would have 6 in play, I would only take into account 5. Now, say for an example, if I'm cheating and I had 2 zips in the back line, and technically it would add up to 7, don't worry about it, just put it back down to 5. You don't have to add exactly, I'm not that mean. So yeah, we have 5 to use here, and we have a really good card here for 5, or we could take him out. If you're playing by how the rules explain it, you would want to defeat this character right now, because that is your objective of the game, is to have your opponent's graveyard reach 5 characters, and if I were to defeat him, that would put us in the lead. Now, since in gameplay the rules are not all that go, and we actually need to have strategy, I don't think I'm going to KO him yet. And by KO, I mean defeat, because knocking out is a different thing that we might get into or might not. So I'm actually going to play Cedric for my 5 and then pass my turn because I have no more actions. Alright, and our opponent played another card here. If we want to see our opponent's side, this is our opponent's side for right now. They do not have 4 actions because that costs 2, so it's our turn again. Oh, look at that, we drew a boost. That's crazy. So the thing with boosts is you can play them like an item, or if we defeat a character, we can play it in the boosts section here, and we can use it for its action cost every turn without discarding it. Now you can only play 1 boost per defeat. Alright, our turn. We drew a card even though we were technically supposed to calculate our actions first, don't worry about it. And we have 5 again. Nothing has changed. None of our characters were defeated. Technically, we go over, but again, you're not allowed to do that. So we have 5 to use here. Since we have 5 to use, I'm going to attach a gear. Now, what is a gear? A gear is an item that you're attaching to a character. I didn't explain this with items, but every card you play has a target. Well, except for character cards. Item cards, boost cards, attacks, they all have a target chosen. For 3-for-1 deal here, draw 3 cards. That's just targeting the person who played it. For gears, the target is whoever you attach it to. Now, using 2 to play this, we're going to attach this to Cedric. And going more into what these symbols are, these are called attributes. They're really only here for matching purposes, which is why I haven't brought it up yet, because not to say it's not important, but again, they're only here for matching purposes. We haven't need to match them yet. Like, this is a weakness, this is a resistance. If this were to be fiery, then I would take 3 extra damage and it would do 10. If this were to be aquatic, it would do 1 less damage and it were to do 6. I'm using this as an example against myself because our opponent also has one of those in play. Fruit tree down here, and it says if this gear and the character it is attached to share an attribute, which in this case it does. See matching purposes, look at that. They both have the organic attribute. The effect is doubled. Ooh, how fun. Deal 1 damage on the character this gear is attached to at the start of your turn. The start of your turn is defined as picking up a card. So if this character were to have damage taken, we can heal up to 2 every turn. And when we're attaching a gear to a backlines character, as you can see, you can't actually, but as you can't see, this says backlines gear, and you attach it behind the backlines character. Up here is the frontlines gear. Gears go everywhere the character it's attached to goes, so if I were to swap Cedric in, the gear would follow him. If Cedric were to be defeated and put into the graveyard, the gear would be detached, and in this case, since it's an item, it's detached and put into the detaching, also specified on the card, and if there is no specified time frame for when it's supposed to be detached, it's just assumed to be there indefinitely until the character is defeated or the game ends. So going back to what I said about using items having a target, we're going to use this. Choose one of your opponent's characters. That character is now disoriented. We're going to use a dizzy spell here, and we're going to target Cornelius, the enemy Cornelius, because he is one of our opponent's characters and he is the target we are choosing. So we are putting that into the discard pile because it is used. And Cornelius here is going to be rotated 90 degrees because that is what disorienting is. Now, what does disorienting mean? It means that this character can no longer give actions, attack, or use abilities. It can still swap, and any passives it might have still take into effect. And now, you know what? Instead of doing the smart thing and drawing 3 cards, I'm going to pick up a card with 1 action. You are allowed to do that once per turn. You can pick up a card for 1 action. And I do believe I forgot to mention, but once a character has the gear attached, the character is no longer targeted and the action cost is not taken into account when the effect is used. This is pretty much a passive now. It is used for free whenever it's taken into effect. As for what passives are, it's the same thing. If we look over at our opponent's side here, we're going to spin around. Passive is an underlined name for an effect on a character card, and it's taken into account every time its condition is met. So in this case, this card takes 2 less damage, so every time this card takes damage, this passive would apply. It's underlined. If you look over here, this is not underlined because it's an ability. Abilities can be used once per turn for 1 action. The attribute abilities and passives are equally matched to the attributes of the card it is on. Again, just for matching purposes. Yeah. And when using an ability, see, since we said choose one of your characters, you would have to target one of your characters. Abilities can only be used once, but if they're applied more than once, they can be, if that makes sense. Like if we were to use this, technically this is a boost. It is an ability in technical terms if it's played over here. So we can only use this once per turn, but all damage done is applied to every damage done. So even though we used this once, it is applied multiple times, or can be applied multiple times. Anyway, whose turn is it? I've been yapping too much. I think it was ours because we just dizzy spelled. Yeah, so we dizzy spelled, which makes our target disoriented. And again, disoriented characters don't give actions, yada yada. So now on our opponent's turn, when they're calculating actions, they take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. See, they would have 5, but since this character is disoriented and it's in the front lines, that means we subtract 1 and there's 4. If there were to be a second zip here and we were to have 5 in the back lines, it would still be 4 because front lines characters are always taken into account. So disorienting a front lines character is usually a pretty good idea because they're always taken into account. If you look in the rules for the priority of action giving, you calculate the actions and then you take into account any effects like disorienting, yada yada. As for what knocking out and rotating 90 degrees is, rotating 90 degrees is, well, what we just did, disorienting, but if we were to rotate 90 degrees again, it would be 180 degrees, which would be classified as knocking out, which is the same thing as disorienting, just with extra steps. So say our opponent doesn't want their character to be disoriented anymore, because who would? They can reorient them 90 degrees for each action point they're willing to spend here. And since they only need to rotate this character once, they only need to spend 1 action. If it were to be 180 degrees, our opponent would have to spend 2 actions to rotate it 180 degrees. For each 90 degrees you rotate to reorient a character, costs 1 action. Cool? Cool. Our opponent here is going to reorient their character, and now they're down 2. They started with 5, but now, since we disoriented them, that made it 4, and then them reorienting made it back to 3. So our opponent only has 3 actions to use this turn, which is quite good. But what's this? Our opponent can play cards too. So our opponent's going to play an energy drink, which gains 3 extra action points to use this turn. They're going to put that into their discard, and I'm not going to flip it because I don't feel like flipping it. So they gain 3 extra action points. It costs 1. So they have 3, makes it 2, makes it back again to 5. So now our opponent's going to attack here. Attacking must be done last. I forgot to mention that this is pretty important. After your turn, all your actions are reset to 0. So our opponent here has 5 actions to use, and they can only use 1 attack. They're going to use Kernel Bomb, and that does 7 rogue damage against my guy, which is going to defeat him. And when you are attacking, you might be thinking, well, if every other effect can target any character, why can't this? Because damaging attacks can only target your opponent's frontlines character. Unless otherwise stated, as you can see on Mr. Sloth, if I were to uncover him, he has an attack that is allowed to target any character. He is going to Kernel Bomb us here, and we are going to be put into the graveyard. Oh no. Now, when we put our card into the graveyard, we are going to flip him 180 degrees, so our opponent can keep track easier of how many characters they've defeated. So that's 1. And now our opponent is going to play a boost, which they are allowed to do because they have defeated a character, and they get to play this for free. If this were to cost 1, 2, 3, whatever, when you're playing a boost into the boost slot, it is free. Using it costs the action cost, but playing it after you defeat is free. They don't get the effect right away. You have to wait until next turn to use it, but yeah. So since our character was defeated, before we do anything else, we need to put a character in the front lines. If you don't have a character to put in the front lines, you lose, even if you have some in your hand. So we're going to put Cedric in the front lines here, which also means his gear comes with him. Alright, now it's our turn. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Alright, we have 5 actions. We're going to draw a card. We have to draw a card. Every time it is your turn, you have to draw a card. If you can't draw a card, you lose. If your deck runs out, you lose. Okay, here is very niche scenario number 69. If you have no actions, instead of picking up a card, you may choose to get what is called a forfeit action. So instead of your opponent walling you, you are allowed to do at least something. Like if we have 1 forfeit action, we can play an energy drink, gain 3, actually do something as opposed to just picking up a card. There is 1 card that deals with forfeit actions, and it's this one right here. It's a boost. You can only play or use this card if you use it with a forfeit action, and then you gain 5 extra action points to use in the turn. So that's, again, very niche scenario. There are certain cards that give 0 actions per turn. There's, again, disorienting, which makes your characters not give any actions at all. Things like that. So it does happen where you get 0 or even negative actions on your turn. If that happens, you can trade in your mandatory card draw for a forfeit action instead. Now, you can still pick up. It just costs your forfeit action and your turn's over now. So most of the time, it's good to just take the forfeit action. Alright, so it's our turn. We have 5 actions. We picked up a card, and we have Gilbert. We're going to play Gilbert. Why? For purposes. Again, we're not trying to win. We're trying to explain rules. So he has a fun ability, and we're going to use it. So choose one of your characters in play. I'm going to choose Cedric. That character takes 1 less damage from all sources during your opponent's next turn. This effect is doubled if the character you chose has less total health than this character's base health. Total health is the health, and any effects that go over remaining health is taking damage into effect. Confusing a little bit, but yes, there is a reason for it. For very niche scenarios. That should be the tagline of this game. Universe A1, very niche scenarios. And he doesn't have less total health. So we're going to use this ability. And since we use this ability and it directly affects our opponent and their next turn, we're going to put him in the just in case zone. The only cards that you don't put in the just in case zone that do this are the frontlines character, because they're already up there. So if we were to activate Gilbert and his ability in the front lines, then we would not be moving him. But since it directly affects our opponent's next turn, and it's not something the opponent would readily see, we're going to put it up there. This still counts as him being in the back lines. It's just, again, so the opponent can recognize, oh yeah, he used this ability, my turn is affected because of it. If you do something like this that affects your opponent and you don't put it in the just in case zone, your opponent is allowed to pick up a card. Now, if they're feigning ignorance, you do put the character, or they say, no, it's okay, I'll remember, and then they don't, they're not allowed to pick up a card. It's looking like our opponent's gonna win this one because I'm rigging it in their favor. So going into our opponent's side here, now you can typically only use effects, play things on your turn, and it is technically before your opponent's turn. But as with a lot of things, say it with me now, very niche scenarios, such as this card right here, certain cards break the fundamental rules. So during your mandatory card draw, so technically we're using this effect before your turn, because your start of your turn is marked as the mandatory card draw, as I mentioned earlier. So we're technically going out of line here, but this card allows it. Deal with it. So during your mandatory card draw, you may draw 2 cards instead of 1. Typically the things that break the rules aren't going to break them in a way that like really breaks the game. Like this isn't going to break the game, if you see what I'm saying. And it's free, so it doesn't even mess with the action, whatever. So our opponent is going to use this. It costs them 0, and they get to pick up 2 cards instead of 1. And instead of playing anything, our opponent is going to opt for 7 rogue damage on my boy Cedric here. Normally this would be in the form of a dice, but okay, stop doing that. Dude, just move the 7. I just want to move the 7. There we go. This would be in the form of a die, but here, I'll put it off to the side. Normally you would put it on the card, but I don't want to cover anything up. This would be in the form of a die, but again, we don't have a die in digital land. These cards would be in your hand. I don't have hands. I have a cursor. So now it is the start of our turn, and it says at the start of your turn, we can heal 2 because we match an attribute. So we're going to make that 5. Cool. Now we get to pick up a card. I'm not going to because I'm oh my gosh, I forgot the just in case zone too. What a silly clown fool I am. It's resisted by 1. See, that's why the just in case zone is here, because even I forgot and I put it there. So yeah, always look in the just in case zone. That's why it's there. What a silly fool I am. See, now we understand the importance of the just in case zone. And since it is our turn and our opponent has taken it into account, we are putting Gilbert back where he belongs, over here. Now, if we were to play Shutdown, there's not going to be a scenario where we're going to be able to, but if we were to play this, this would also go in the just in case zone, and then after your opponent calculates their actions, you can put this in the discard pile. And again, if it's in the just in case zone, it's still classified as wherever it is. Like if I put this up there, it's still technically in the discard pile. Gilbert was still technically in the back lines, so they're still treated as wherever they were. Again, it's just in case your opponent needs to reference something quickly. The only cards that are not in play are the cards in the graveyard and cards in the discard pile. So yeah, discard pile and graveyard, not in play. I cannot use his attack. I cannot swap him. He is there. How long has this been going on for? 46 minutes, because I really only need to explain swapping. I'm not even gonna swap. I'm just gonna say I'm swapping. So if I wanted to swap for some reason with Zip, we would take the action cost of each of these characters and find their difference, which in this case, 5 minus 1 is 4, so it would cost 4 action points to switch these characters. Now, if Cedric were to be back here and Zip were to be up here, it would still be 5 minus 1. Don't deal with the negative numbers, okay? And you always take the highest action cost and subtract the lowest. If we were to have a card like this, where swapping this character out, swapping out is taking your front lines character, moving into the back lines. But if we were to be swapping out with this character, it costs 1 less action point. So in that case, it would cost 3 if this character was swapping out. Now, say this character is in our front lines here, and both cost 1. So if I was swapping with Zip here and both cost 1, the difference would be 0, but you would still need to spend 1 action point. So if the difference is 0, you still spend 1. Now, because of the ability, it is taken into account after everything else is taken into account. So it's basically base rules and then the exceptions. So the base rules say 1 minus 1 is 0, but we have to spend 1. So 0 equals 1. And then we take into account the effect here, which is 1 less. So then it actually would cost 0. Swapping out, swapping in, swapping out, swapping in. And now, since we have 4 damage, and pummeling does 1 extra damage for each point of damage on this character, each point of damage is basically for every 1 damage. So there are 4 1s here, because 4 1s is 4. So this would do 4 plus 4, which is 8, which is more than enough to take out Cornelius here. So we're going to do that, and then your opponent would put it in the graveyard. And then we would go back and forth and see who wins. So your deck runs out, that's fine. On your next turn, however, if you can't pick up a card, you lose. And we defeated Cornelius, oh no. And they don't have a frontlines character to put in. You lose. I think the only thing I didn't go over is weakness and resistance, which is just, again, modifications to the damage applied last. If we take this card, for example, we do 1 extra damage for each. Let's just say this is fiery and we're going against ourselves here. So it does 1 extra damage, so it'd do 4 plus 4, which is 8, and then we would take into account this, which is plus 2. Now, let's just say this does 4 times 4, so 16, and then we would add 2, which is 18. Now, if we were to do like 6 times 4, so you what I mean? That's where it gets messy, and then it's 24. So you always want to apply this last to avoid any confusion. For any other things, effects, and priority, you would do the multiplication first and then the addition, order of operations kind of thing. But again, weakness, resistance, always applied last. And yes, that includes for backlines characters. I know certain games don't have weakness and resistance applied for the backlines characters, but this one's does. Here, let's get a look at Mr. Sloth here. He has a few exceptions too. So he has a passive when hit by electric. So again, anything with the electric attribute, we take no damage. So if I were to hit myself with static beam, it would do literally nothing, except for charging my static beam, which now does 3 extra damage next turn. So then next turn, this would do 7, and then we can target any character. Now, if you defeat one of your own characters, you're not allowed to play a boost, nor is your opponent allowed to play a boost. The only time your opponent is allowed to play the boost is if your opponent defeats a character. Again, for every defeat is when you can play a boost. Putting into a graveyard or having your own character defeated doesn't count as a defeat. Cool? Cool. Buy my game.